So now we're going to talk a little bit about one thing that I mentioned during my talk this morning, which was the tobacco control example that I gave, and I showed how we created different brands for different subcultures. So that little thing that I said for a minute and a half, we're going to dive into that during these 20 minutes. And if you happen to have missed that session, my name is Jeff Jordan from Rescue Social Change Group, based in the States, and we exclusively work on positive behavior change. Now, today's talk is going to focus on our examples in tobacco control, but this work can be applied to many different behaviors, including alcohol, which we've heard about today, and I'll throw in a few tidbits about that. Our tobacco control work actually happens all over the U.S. We do a tremendous amount of work in tobacco control, and so this is based on. We're going to specifically hone in on our work in the state of Virginia, which is on the east coast of the U.S., but this is essentially our approach that we use in many different states to reach young people. So first, the theory that kind of underlines what we're going to talk about. As I said this morning, there's at least 5 different paths to behavior change, and the one that we're going to be talking about today is specifically culture change. Now, when we look at culture change within tobacco control, we can't help but first begin with tobacco industry advertising. Now, even though many countries have made significant strides towards blocking tobacco industry advertising, Australia being a leader in that process, we have to understand how we got here and what it is that the tobacco industry did to bring us to the point where we're at, where certain people smoke and certain people don't smoke, et cetera. And what we find by looking into the history, the 100-year history really of tobacco industry advertising, is that we find that the tobacco industry has successfully associated itself with people's identities, similar to how the alcohol industry does so, how fast food companies have been able to do so. It's not really about advertising their product as much as it is advertising the role of their product in specific people's lifestyles. And the way that the tobacco industry does this, as well as other industries in the commercial world, is that they have multiple brands. Even within the single company, they will have multiple brands advertising to different kinds of people. Now, why is this so critical? It's because in social marketing, we tend to create a single campaign to reach everybody. Now, the first thing to know about that is that there is no such thing as a campaign to reach everybody. There has never been a commercial brand that appeals to everybody, not Nike or Coke or Apple or Google, or no other brand with billions of dollars more than you have has been able to create a brand that appeals to everybody. So what we have to keep in mind is that every brand, every campaign is going to reach one group more effectively than other groups. Now the question is whether or not we know which group that is. So if you are telling yourself that your campaign is going to reach everybody in Queensland or everybody in Victoria or everybody in Virginia or everybody in your country, that means you don't really know who it's actually going to reach and who it's not going to reach. It may be that the people that are being reached are those at risk and you lucked out. Or it might be that you're actually reaching the low-risk people and completely missing those who are at risk. Now, what we saw when we looked into tobacco industry marketing is that we saw that the lifestyles that they went after were very clear. Marlboro was very much associated with country culture and the rural kind of manly culture that Marlboro is known for. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to be a cowboy to smoke Marlboro, but if you want to be a little bit country, Marlboro can be your way to be a little bit country. Now, if that's not your bag, well, we've got Kool cigarettes that appeals to hip-hop culture in the U.S., and that's very similar to Newport's strategy as well as Salem and other brands. And so this is now targeting a completely different audience and convincing them that tobacco use is associated with their identity. But if that's not you, well, then you have brands like Camel that are associated with more hipster and alternative rock culture, associating themselves with live music and indie bands and things like that to let you know that if that's the kind of person that you are, well, tobacco is also associated with your identity. What the tobacco industry understands, as well as the alcohol industry and the food industry, is that who you are motivates behavior more powerfully than what you know. They understand that if they can align their behavior with your identity, then you're going to desire the behavior. Not just logically and rationally come to the decision to behave, but you're actually going to want to do it. And that's something that we always miss in our campaigns. Are we just giving people a reason not to do it, or are we making them want to not do it and want to do something else? getting to that innate desire actually requires that we give them a positive reason to engage in a behavior that is more than just our health, that it actually aligns with our identity. Now, the way to do that, this is the most simplistic way to describe it, is that we each have our own identity. And within our own identity, we have experiences that teach us how to live that identity. So we learn as we grow up from our peers, from influencers, from the media, that we have to behave in this way and that way and that way to be that kind of person. Over time, we begin to form associations between the identity that we want to embody for ourselves and the behaviors that society has decided are the behaviors that are associated with that identity. And then once that association is formed, we begin to emulate. There's a reason that rebellious teenagers want to smoke cigarettes or that fun party teenagers want to binge drink. It's because they've grown up seeing images of that identity associated with that behavior, and they desire that identity, so consequently, they desire to engage in that behavior as well. Now, in order to kind of break this down, you can do this many different ways. You can segment your audience in many different ways. The segmentation strategy that we use is called peer crowds, which I very briefly mentioned this morning. Peer crowds are defined as the macro level connections between peer groups with similar interests, lifestyles, influencers, and habits. So while a teenager has his or her peer group that he hangs out with, both that peer group and the teenager belong to a larger peer crowd that shares significant cultural similarities across geographic areas. So, and this also, we've done research with young adults as well. So even though this particular research I'm going to show you is with high school students, ages 14 to 18, we see that peer crowds also exist in 18 to 24-year-olds. So what is the evidence? Well, the way that we conduct research in this area is we use images. So people have trouble labeling themselves and not that much trouble labeling each other. But the thing is we want people to tell us who they are. And so to do that, images are much more helpful. So people will organize images for us in research based on who they think hang out with each other. And then they will tell us which groups they identify with and which groups they don't identify with. And based on the collection of images from many different people in the organization, we're able to put it into a social network analysis that actually is an analysis of the relationship between the images themselves. And we're able to find that which groups are most likely to exist in a specific community. And having done this research throughout the US and in a couple of locations in Canada, we found that there's 5 or 6 peer crowds that tend to come up when we're doing teen research. The largest and most common peer crowd we run into is mainstream culture. Mainstream culture is usually teenagers that define themselves by something other than their social group. It might be sports or academics or taking care of a sibling at home or having a career in the future, going to college, whatever it is, they have some other priority that's a little bit more important. It doesn't mean that they're cool or uncool. It just means that this other priority is number one. So they're not going to risk it by engaging in binge drinking, for example, in order to be cool, because that may threaten that other identity that they have. Mainstream teens are the teenager that every parent wants. And oftentimes, our campaigns depict mainstream teenagers. Because this group is so large and so visible, we tend to assume that all teenagers are mainstream, but they're not. Just a large portion of them are. The next common group that we see in North America is preppy. And preppy looks kind of similar to mainstream, but they care more about being cool. And they go out more. These are the kids that in North America are binge drinking. They tend to be the ones who grow up to go into sororities and fraternities when they go to college. And they tend to be popular. They tend to be described as the pretty people, the fun people. Sometimes they're described as the rich kids because they tend to have more fashionable clothing and things like that. Then we have alternative culture. Now, alternative culture is really a counterculture. Their main goal is not to be mainstream, not to be like the preppy kids. They really dislike the preppy kids because they think that the preppy kids are all trying to just be clones of each other, and they value more the individuality of their own identity, of their music, of their art, of their hobbies, etc. So this is a really important note because if whatever behavior you're targeting is being done by the alternative kids, but your images depict preppy kids, well, then all you've done is confirmed to the alternative kids that they should not be doing that behavior because they don't want to be anything like those preppy kids, right? So depending on who you want to target, your messages and imagery would be completely different. The other cultures that we see in North America are country culture, which is more rural culture, more kind of living off the land, more hunting and mudding and getting dirty, and they're a little bit less connected digitally than the other groups are, less concerned about their style and things like that. Then we have hip hop culture, which is not just kind of top hip hop music, but it's really deep into hip hop culture. Identifying with rappers and the storylines that come in rap music and the struggle that is described in that, in those raps, they align with that based on their own background and their own neighborhoods. And then lastly, we have a culture that is pretty small in high school, LGBT, but as soon as we get to young adulthood, it becomes a much bigger culture, which is gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender. So what we did is in Virginia, we took these images that we had found that identify with these different groups, and we put them on a survey that we call the iBase survey. We surveyed 3,500 juniors and seniors across Virginia using a random sampling methodology across 21 different high schools. The data was collected in 2011, so it's starting to get a little bit old, but it's still driving the design of how the state is structured in terms of its tobacco prevention strategy. So what we found during that research was that this was the distribution of the peer crowds. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that they don't add up to 100%, and that's because there is overlap, and that's okay. Teens do not perfectly fit into these groups. They sometimes mix influence from different groups, and that's perfectly fine. What we want to know is where's kind of like your behavior coming from, and so we do that by asking about the different behaviors. So in this case, we were looking at smoking behavior. And what we saw was that there was more smoking in hip hop, alternative, and country peer crowds than there was in the mainstream and preppy peer crowds. Now, if you're doing the math, though, you might say, well, 15% of the preppy kids smoke, but they have a really big peer crowd, right? Much bigger than alternative and country. So if we targeted the preppy kids, maybe we would reach more youth. Or we would reach maybe the alternative kids that have a higher tobacco use rate, but they're a smaller peer crowd. How do we decide which to do? So the way that we decide that is by looking at the odds of using tobacco. So the survey that we do, it gives us a score between -12 and +12 for every peer crowd for every person. So you may have your hip hop score, your preppy score, your alternative score, you have a score in every category. So we're able to do a regression to analyze where is risk coming from. And what we see is that even though there were some preppy smokers and some mainstream smokers, every single point that you went up on the preppy scale or on the mainstream scale, your odds of using tobacco went down and down and down. So if you were 100% preppy, you had very, very, very low odds of using tobacco. In contrast, for every point that you went up in hip hop, every point that you went up in alternative, and every point you went up in country, your odds of smoking kept creeping up and up and up. So let's think about like an epidemiologist, right? So if there's a virus, and this virus is tobacco use, you want to know, well, where is the source of the virus? And tobacco is a cultural virus. And so in this case, even though we are seeing a little bit of the smoking disease among preppy and mainstream kids, the source of that disease is actually coming from hip hop, alternative, and country culture. And if we are to extinguish the disease or cure it from culture, we would have to go into those sources in order to stop it from bleeding into those other peer crowds. So what is this peer crowd and why does it matter? Well, peer crowds are based on life experiences. It's not just how these kids dress and what kind of clothing they like. It's actually their values and their identity and their attitudes. And that's why they're making decisions to behave for some reason or not behave for another reason. By segmenting them based on their peer crowd, it's kind of like a prism. We're able to understand the clear and distinct values that these different peer crowds have, which then allow us to structure our social marketing campaign better for who they are and for what their values are. For example, these are some different values that we've measured, not through this study, but through other subsequent qualitative studies. So the first value, companies and corporations should be able to do whatever they want. Country kids agree with that, and alternative kids disagree with that, and the others are just neutral. So what that means is that a big anti-industry campaign, like if any of you are familiar with the Truth campaign that occurred in the US years ago, would work really well with the alternative kids, but would not work with the country kids that think that companies should be able to do what they want. They just would not identify with that message. In contrast, I'm going to be famous is a value that hip hop kids really agreed with, but that mainstream and country kids don't agree with that much. So again, if you want to show them how being tobacco-free makes you more likely to be famous, it's going to be the hip hop kids that will listen to you and not the others. So this is important because what we talk about, the reasons that we give people to engage in a behavior or not engage in a behavior will or will not resonate based on what their own values are. And so this is why when we talk about that there's no such thing as a single campaign that reaches everybody, it's because every campaign has an argument. It has a reason that you should engage in something, and only certain people care about what it is that you're talking about. Understanding their culture and their peer crowd, whether you call it a peer crowd or not, helps you understand which group you can convince with one message versus another. So what does the strategy look like? We call our approach to culture change social branding, and it's a behavior change marketing strategy that utilizes these peer crowd targeted social brands to associate a healthy behavior with a certain desirable lifestyle. So we take that original cycle that I showed you and we introduce a social brand to compete with the current role models, and then introduce that new behavior as an influencer within that culture. So we don't want to be an outsider to hip hop, we want to be a part of hip hop culture. We want to be a part of alternative culture. And we use all of these different tools that we have, like paid digital media and traditional media, events, social media, street promotions, everything that we have to design these campaigns to specifically reach each of these different peer crowds. Now, typically, what we see when we don't know who our audience is we see images like this. Images of multiracial groups of teens who are very happy to be in multiracial groups of teens. But in reality, this is nowhere near the reality of teenage life. It doesn't mean that teenagers are racist or anything, it's just that they don't always plan to ensure that there is one Asian and one black in their peer group. They kind of let it be a little bit more naturally occurring than that. So what we convinced the state of Virginia to do was to divide their culture change strategy into 3 different campaigns. One to reach alternative teens, one to reach country, and one to reach hip hop teens. And many people have asked me already, well, how do you what if you don't have enough money to do this? What if you only have money for one campaign? Well, even if Virginia only had money to do one campaign, we would still tell them to pick one of these groups and go after them. Because targeting one of these groups with an authentic message that aligns with their values is going to be more effective than imagining that we are reaching everybody at the same time. Because we're not really reaching everybody at the same time, so this at least effectively reaches somebody rather than generically reaching nobody. And what this looks like, you saw a preview of this in the morning. I'll show you a few more from these campaigns. So this is Fresh Society, the hip hop campaign.
My shoe game's so sick, it'll make you woozy. My outfit's looking like I'm shooting a movie, so excuse me if all the people in your world wanna choose me. Cause I'm fresh, my dreams go beyond that platinum. Working hard in the game, outlasting them, leaving nobody wondering what happened to him. Cause I'm next. See, I'ma be the last man standing. Avoiding tobacco so my future keeps expanding. Tobacco-free living cause my life I'm commanding. I'm permanent. I'm fresh, next, permanent. I'm tobacco-free. That's Fresh Society.
So you see a lot of the values in there of what hip hop kids want in their life and connecting that with the idea of being tobacco free, because that's essentially what culture change is you want to reprogram the values that people have and the behaviors that they've associated with them. And to do that, you need reasoning that is authentic and reasonable to someone from that culture. And so then we move to country, which is down and dirty, and this is their effort.
There's nothing better than growing up in a small town.
Everybody knows everybody. If I'm broke down or something like that, they're always there to help me.
I like living in the sticks. People here usually take care of each other and care about each other.
So when I heard that 1,300 Americans die each day because of tobacco, I couldn't help but think about my hometown. In fact, that's more than the population of 1/3 of Virginia's towns. I don't want to see anyone from my town killed off by tobacco. That's why I choose to live tobacco-free.
So a very family-oriented, small-town-oriented message because that is what their values are and what their lifestyle is. And then lastly, an alternative brand.
To describe our band's sound, I'll have to say melodic metal.
If you're touring right and if you're treating your body right, it's awesome. It's not only a mental game, but it's a physical game too. I smoked cigarettes for 5 years and I quit. I've never felt better in my entire life. Secondhand smoke honestly just dampers the entire room's energy.
The scent, the bad breath, the yellow teeth.
Smoking just isn't our thing. It's not our style and it never will be.
So again, a different message for a different peer crowd. And so that is the point of this is that peer crowds allow you to seem like you are coming from within their culture rather than a government agency or some other adult group outside of them trying to change them. And it allows you to target them the same way that the tobacco companies do, that the alcohol companies do, that the fast food companies do. And so this gives you the edge that the commercial companies currently have that we really aren't quite embracing yet in behavior change. So thank you for your time, and I will be around during the break for questions.